There was one horrible summer, in my opinion. Basil was getting on in years, so he was elderly. He wasn't hurt or anything yet, but he was at those ages where you had to keep an eye on him. And he picked up this terrible habit of sleeping in the box at the very front of the fox enclosure with his upside down, with his head hanging out, with his tongue slightly out of his mouth. And so you would come up on tours, and there would be this fox, and he's usually the only one you could see because the girls are better at hiding, just going. And tourists would give these horrified gasps, and you'd be going, no, he's fine, really. I mean, there were times I had to go and get the key and let myself in the enclosure and go up and, see, he moves, he's fine. Hurry away again. Oh, he was so special.
4. One morning, Pat came out to the park to discover the fox enclosure empty. She was alerted to this fact by Corey, sitting in front of the drive-through gate going, Mom, Dad, where are you? And as we have all recounted Basil's love of anything large and furry, I was quite convinced that Basil had gone ahead of his time by climbing over the fence into the wolf enclosure. However, several hours later, Basil was found coming through the bison field with his ear bloodied and torn after losing a battle with what I can only assume was a piece of barbed wire. But he knew where he had it good, and he didn't stay gone for long.
So now the question remains, have we found all the mice in all the corners of all the buildings?
We'll find out this summer.
That, your answer is no.
This is called the Ringhammer Bridge, which I didn't want it to be named, but the people who paid for it had the right. I was going to call it the Amanda Bridge because she was the one who discovered it.
We all know whose bridge it is. On several of Basil's walks around the parks, there was one time in particular that I'm not quite sure who was more startled. The bison that were on both sides of the bridge or Basil to discover himself surrounded by bison on both sides of the bridge. Little known fact, I think Pat and Alistair and I are the only ones that are aware of this. Basil did actually spend some time in the main enclosure one afternoon. Didn't find it nearly as interesting since it was empty at the time, though. Most of Basil's walks that I took him on started obviously at the fox enclosure and then headed over to the bleachers and would end up here. And I don't know if the half-mile walk was just a little too long for him, if the slope was a little too steep, but for some reason it was always right about here that he would drag his feet. I don't want to go. I don't want to go. You can't make me. Also, before some selective pruning was done, Basil would always try to sneak under the safety fence there, and there were quite a few low-hanging branches, which again, much like the bleachers over by the demonstration area, were always challenging for those new and experienced at walking Basil. So Basil, thank you for taking us to places we would not have gone without you.
Perhaps not my best memory of Basil, but certainly one of my most vivid is actually the direct result of Basil's architecture that he did in the enclosure in here, making an amazing array of tunnels with the girls. It would make sense then that Basil also helped us try to fill in said dens. We had a huge cartload of dirt brought in, and unfortunately it was very thick, very wet, and had these huge clumps And Basil definitely did not approve of the management design that Jess and I had implemented in the fox enclosure, and protested very frequently by picking up large globs of dirt, biting them in half, running up, and spitting dirt all over us while we were trying to shovel things and move them around. Obviously not thrilled with us filling in the dens that he had worked so hard to create and engineer. So Basil, I'm sorry that we didn't appreciate your creative design.
Speaking of creative design, one of my most vivid memories of Basil was at some point, someone who I really do not know taught him to put his mouth around people and grin widely, with all of his teeth exposed. They thought this was cute. They petted him. So he would do this to everyone. And it was very educational for me, teaching a number of people how to stop that, how to extinguish that behavior. But what I remember most vividly was an 8-year-old kid and his mother. And I warned them thoroughly before we went in. And he was extremely well behaved. And Basil came up and greeted and smiled and went, and watching the mom's eyes get 78 times as big, I thank Basil for teaching everyone that even things that small and that friendly have teeth. And they still have their own opinions.
Tell that story, man.
What many of you may not know is that the back half of the fox enclosure was built before the front half of the fox enclosure was built. And as we were moving their furniture from the enclosure down by the dam over here, Angel was sequestered in a small cage in the education building, which at the time was the gift shop building, waiting for the vet to show up to give her annual vaccinations, while Basil had free run the back half of the enclosure. And during the several truckloads of furniture that were moved in, Basil was a very expectant brand new homeowner and would run around tripping the movers, telling them exactly which room that piece of furniture went, and don't you drop it, and did you scratch that? I think he approved of the new enclosure after all.
When Rinky was deposed, we couldn't put him back in with the pack normally. We had to walk him around, and one of the first times we did that, Basil was right over there on that platform. Rinky made a beeline, Basil started screaming, and ever since then, Rinky would always check. Is Basil here? Is Basil here? Is Basil here?
Considering how much time Basil spent in the buildings, and especially the education building towards the end, I do think it is a testament to his good behavior that as far as we know, he only peed in there twice.
Varying vice, on the other hand.
I hope they can say the same of me in my future.